Joining us now is John Nichols. John is the Washington correspondent for The Nation. He has written the Beat column since 1999. He has written a bunch of great books. He has been published in a bunch of good publications, and he joins us now. John, thanks for coming on.
All secondary to being on with Eskow.
Okay, then.
That whole list there means nothing if I'm not on your show.
Well, that's exactly the right attitude, and that's one of the reasons why I respect your judgment so much. Now, John Nichols, I wanted to talk to you about Scott Walker. Now, first of all, just because I was a rock and roll musician as a teenager, Scott Walker was the lead singer of the Walker Brothers' big hit, "The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore." If I read your piece correctly...
No, hold it. Let's stop right there before you go further.
Okay. All right.
We're going down that avenue.
Walk it with me, brother.
I think it's important to point out that Scott Walker continues to perform.
Yes.
And is actually a very avant-garde, fascinating musician doing some of the most out-there music in the world. And of all and I've never been able to say this on any radio show, of all the many policy objections I have to Scott Walker, I am perhaps most concerned. Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration. I'm quite concerned about what he's done to the name of musician Scott Walker.
And imagine what it would be like if he was named Alex Chilton. I just throw that out.
Well, you're not going to mess with the box top, though.
All right. Loneliness is the cloak you wear. I hear that every time I hear the name Scott Walker. But having said that, okay, title, and I know we writers don't always pick our headlines, but it pretty well captures the piece. Headline in The Nation: Get ready for Scott Walker and the ruthless politics of Walkerism. Did you come up with Walkerism?
I did.
It's like The Walking Dead, you know. I mean, it's.
Well, it's got many variations. The reason I came up with it, Richard, is that I thought it was very important to distinguish what he's up to from conservatism, from republicanism, because I think that too many of us, frankly, of people who comment on politics, we tend to fall into very easy, very narrow categorization, which does not reveal the wholeness of what somebody's about. And in this case, there are Republicans who I may disagree with passionately, but I think of as, serious players who, want to advance the ideals they believe in. There are tons of conservatives who I disagree with, but I think of as very sincere folks who frankly, might even find an issue where we could work together.
Right.
Scott Walker's not that.
Now, you write...
That's not what Scott Walker is.
Yes, here's what you have to say about Scott Walker, John Nichols. In The Nation, you say that he is the most politically savvy and comfortably cynical contender for the presidency since Richard Nixon. Wow. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, I defer to John Dean, the White House counsel for Richard Nixon, and the guy, probably the one guy who kind of came out honorable from the whole thing, because he realized ultimately what was going on, and he spoke truth to power. And John Dean has continued to be a great observer of Republicans who go awry. And the interesting thing is that from a very early period in Walker's presence on the national stage, John Dean has referred to Scott Walker as more Nixonian than Nixon. And as I say in the article, that's a very carefully chosen phrase. He does not say that Scott Walker is like Nixon. He says he's more Nixonian than Nixon, which is to say that if you take those elements of Nixon that we societally now identify as the most problematic and amplify them, you find them in Scott Walker. And that's a very important thing to understand, because it's not to say that Scott Walker's necessarily worse than Nixon, but it is to say that Scott Walker takes what we didn't like about Nixon and updates it to the 21st century.
So he's like...
Well,
Go ahead.
But I just say that there's thought. imagine Nixon with social media. Imagine Nixon with our collapsed mainstream media, with our mainstream media that no longer, has that sort of, whether you like it or not, the Walter Cronkite Center that you could go to. Imagine Nixon with unlimited money in politics. And start to think about some of these things. Imagine Nixon with the Democratic Party that has largely forgotten its Roosevelt New Deal touchstones. Not always, but in many cases. Suddenly, you start to see a very powerful figure there who maybe can do things today in the 21st century that past political figures, not just Nixon but others, who we maybe disagreed with, they can do a lot more damage.
So Nixon with tools that weren't available, a kind of tincture of a distillate of Nixon but with all the tools of the 21st century at his command.
That is what I suggest in the article. And I think that if we are serious about it, what we have to acknowledge is that Scott Walker's greatest similarity to Nixon is not, some foreign policy thing, or it's not, some personal quirk. It is that Nixon valued political advancement, his own political advancement, above all else. That was his sort of reason for being in politics, was to keep going, to keep moving up that ladder. And so Nixon, 1946, beats Jerry Voorhis for Congress in a brutal campaign. Nixon, 1950, gets himself elected to the U.S. Senate. Nixon, 1952, running for Vice President of the United States. Nixon, 8 years later, running for president. Beaten for governor, turns around, running for president again. That's Nixon. Scott Walker, 1990, gets beat for a legislative seat, moves to a suburban seat that's easier to win, wins that seat, immediately starts talking about maybe running for lieutenant governor, gets pushed aside for that, finds an opening for Milwaukee County executive, runs for it, gets that gig, immediately starts running for governor, gets pushed aside in one race, moves immediately to run in the next, gets elected governor, turns around, and is almost immediately running for president.
So what you're talking about essentially is, look, everybody who runs for higher office has some element of ambition, but you're really talking about ruthless, unscrupulous, unmitigated ambition. That's what it sounds like you're describing here. And my reaction to both your article and your comments now, John Nichols, Washington correspondent of The Nation, is, well, they're talking about him as a second-string presidential contender right now, but this guy could win.
Well, listen to what Gwen Moore, and I quote her in the article, Gwen Moore, the congresswoman from Milwaukee, who I will note is the one person who beat Scott Walker. She beat him back in his first legislative race back in 1990 when he dropped out of college to run for the legislature, or at least dropped out of college and immediately turned around and was running for the legislature. What Gwen Moore says is her warning is not to Democrats, is not to progressives. She says, Republicans, you better be careful with this guy because he'll stab you in the back. He will do what he needs to do to get ahead. And I had a friend who was up in New Hampshire at the forum they had on Monday of all the Republican candidates, and he said, I watched Walker up there, and he really wasn't very impressive. He was kind of dull compared to the other candidates. And that's going to be pretty true tonight, by the way, in the debate, or it's going to be true in the Republican debate. But this is the interesting thing about it. It doesn't matter. Scott Walker, he's not event-driven. He's not about, getting it perfect in this debate or something like that. He's never been a great debater. He's frankly not the greatest orator or anything like that. The thing about Scott Walker to understand, and this is a comparison not to Nixon but perhaps to Dick Cheney, is Scott Walker's the guy who gets up 2 hours before everybody else, reads harder, thinks more, calculates more, and is more deferent to and respectful of the money power and whatever other structural power he has to respond to than anybody else. And so Scott Walker on Monday night, not overly impressive at the forum. Scott Walker on Thursday night. Probably not overly impressive in the debate, although who knows. But what did Scott Walker announce this week? Is going to spend, or his PAC, I think it is going to spend $7 million in Iowa, more than anybody else on immediate TV buys. Now, you tell me at the end of the day, does Scott Walker have to be the most exciting candidate? Does he have to be the best debater? Or, if he can get himself in position, will his incredible work ethic, and give him that, as well as his incredible deference to the money power, get him in a position where he can be highly competitive, maybe the nominee? Answer yes. And then if he is the nominee, do I think Scott Walker's going to be the president? No, I don't, frankly. I think that the actual balances in the United States go against probably any Republican winning in 2016, although I may be wrong. But this is what I can tell you. If he is the Republican nominee, after having run incredibly hard to the right in the primaries, he will immediately pivot and position himself as, likable, moderate, relatively moderate, not centrist, but relatively moderate, not threatening, because that's exactly what he always does.
All right.
And
so
he understands that you can pivot in this media climate if you got enough money behind you, and an awful lot of people are going to let you do it.
So, okay, Scott Walker, frightening, unusual kind of, I'm getting this mental image of, the political version of the kind of animal that bares its teeth and takes a submissive position, and then as soon as you turn your back, gnaws your legs off.